Everyone to Health for the World International Grand Rounds. It's my honor to introduce our reputed speaker today, Dr. Walter Orenstein. Dr. Orenstein is a professor of medicine, epidemiology, global health, and pediatrics, as well as associate director of Emory Vaccine Center and director of the Emory Program on Vaccine Policy and Development since 2011. From 2008 to 2011, he was a deputy director for immunization programs in the vaccine delivery department of the Global Health Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. His primary focus at the foundation was polio eradication, measles control, and improving routine immunization programs. Between 2004 and 2008, he held the same positions as his current Emory appointments, as well as other responsibilities. Prior to 2004, Dr. Orenstein worked for 26 years in the immunization program at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. From 1988 to 2004, he was the director of the U.S. Immunization Program. He's a former Assistant Surgeon General of the U.S. PHS, and he has successfully developed, promoted, facilitated, and expanded new vaccination strategies to enhance disease prevention. Dr. Orenstein has authored and co-authored numerous books, journals, and reviews, and has received multiple awards. In 2006, he was elected to the National Institute of Medicine. Currently, he's a member of WHO's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, Measles, and Rubella Working Group. He received his bachelor degree at the City College of New York in 1968 and his degree in medicine from Albert Einstein College of Medicine in 1972. He completed an internship and residency in pediatrics at UCSF and Children's Hospital of LA, followed by a fellowship in infectious disease at the UC Medical School. He's a world-renowned authority in polio, measles, and multiple other diseases. We are honored to have him here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Orenstein, for addressing this important topic for our audience. You can go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad to be talking about polio eradication. The title is Nearly There, but nearly there is not where we need to be. We need to be there, and we need to put the last efforts in to getting rid of the last chains of polio transmission. I won't do that. I have one faculty disclosure. I am a member of the Moderna Scientific Advisory Board with regard to their COVID-19 vaccine. So the topics I'd like to cover is smallpox and just explain disease eradication, smallpox being the only human disease thus far that has been actually eradicated. Then to go into basic backgrounds on polio, the pathogenesis, the clinical aspects, the epidemiology, the tools we have, the oral polio vaccines and the inactivated polio vaccines, what the strategies are and how we go, the end game, mitigating risks of potential reintroductions, polio vaccines of the future, and then the meaning of eradication to us and the world. So these are 7 areas. What is eradication? What does it mean? Polio, the eradication strategy, where we are today, the end game, and finally getting there, recent recommendations, and what eradication would mean to us and the world. So the first is polio as a candidate. But before I do that, I just want to show you a picture of Shanti, daughter of Pyari Lal. I took this in India in 1975. This was a couple of hours after she died from an unusual complication of smallpox, late hemorrhagic smallpox. She was the last case of smallpox in Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state in population, and the last naturally occurring case of smallpox was in 1977. And there were a lot of features of smallpox that made it easy to eradicate. One is you could see the disease. I could teach a layperson how to make a differential diagnosis of smallpox. We would use this picture to find cases and we could define who was exposed and who they might expose and vaccinate both groups. So it was called surveillance and containment and ring vaccination. As I'll show you, unfortunately, that can't apply to polio. But again, this was taking advantage of learning about the actual disease and its epidemiology that led to this strategy to eradication. And the benefits have been intense. Since 1967, when an effort intensified to eradicate polio, smallpox, there were 31 endemic countries at the time, an estimated 10 to 15 million cases, 1.5 to 2 million deaths, and for a total of $300 million in investment, and estimated benefits of $1 billion per year. So what is global eradication? It's the worldwide absence of a specific disease agent in nature as a result of deliberate control efforts that might be discontinued if it was felt to not be a significant risk. And so with smallpox, we stopped vaccinating. In fact, the US stopped even before the last case, 1972, in vaccination. Eradication is a very unforgiving goal. One infection is one infection too many. So eradication is zero forever. The generation that achieves eradication really contributes to every future generation and their health. There are 4 general criteria that people use to determine whether a given pathogen is a candidate for eradication. 1, there must be an effective practical intervention that can interrupt transmission. 2, that there must be diagnostic tools to determine who is infected and who is not, and that are highly sensitive. 3, there must be an absence of a non-human reservoir so that you don't have to get rid of it in an animal population you might not be able to get rid of it in, such as birds or whatever. And the goal is humans are essential, and you break the chain of transmission in humans. And then before you adopt a goal, you want to see some proof of evidence that the strategy you have is actually working. In other words, eliminating the disease in substantial large populations in large geographic areas. So what about polio? Well, this is a scene from the Rancho de los Amigos Hospital in Southern California in the early 50s. It's a ward full of people on drinker respirators, better known as iron lungs. This was polio. This scared the living daylights out of people. And I was a real anti-vaxxer in 1955 at the age of 7 and not wanting a shot for something I knew nothing about. And my mother saying to me, better you should cry than I should cry. People wanted vaccine, very different than what we're seeing for COVID today. And this is polio in low and middle income countries. What the polio virus does is it attacks the anterior horn cells in your spinal cord and similar cells in your bulbar brain. And this is like cutting the wires to a light bulb. It loses the ability to work. So while your sensory nerves are working fine, you lose the ability to move your muscles and you get this lameness. And in fact, for years, people didn't think polio was a big problem in low and middle income countries because they didn't see outbreaks. But then they did these lameness surveys and showed it was a big, big problem. So polio is a candidate, and I just want to go over. 1, is that poliovirus requires a specific cell receptor on human cells. Some high-level primates have the same receptor, but they're not large enough to maintain transmission. So polio does meet the criterion that humans are required for its life cycle. Number two is that there must be sensitive and specific diagnostic tools. And here it's not as good as smallpox. What we do is acute flaccid paralysis surveillance. Then we get virologic testing of stool, now most commonly PCR testing, and then we can do genetic sequencing to see how related it is to other polioviruses. We have two very effective interventions, the oral polio vaccine and the inactivated vaccine. And we have substantial proof of principle. Wild polioviruses have been certified as eliminated in 5 of the 6 WHO regions. Only the Eastern Mediterranean region is considered endemic for polio wild virus. Now, one of the issues is that polio is very different than smallpox is the characteristics in this slide. One, transmission is generally person to person, so that's similar. In industrialized countries, high-income countries with good sanitation and hygiene, the focus is primarily oral transmission, and that's important when we talk about the vaccines regarded because the inactivated vaccine induces very good oral immunity, not such a good intestinal immunity. In low and middle income countries, the primary mode of transmission is thought to be fecal oral because virus is excreted in the feces at higher titers, and with not the best hygiene and sanitation, it can spread. About 72% of infections have no symptoms whatsoever. So in contrast to smallpox, where you could trace out and find out who gave it to you, with polio, you generally will not know where you were infected to if you have paralytic disease. 24%, about a quarter, have what's called a minor illness, which is 1 to 3 days of fever, feeling bad, drowsiness, headache, nausea, vomiting, constipation, or sore throat in various combinations. About 1 in 25 infected develop aseptic meningitis, 4%, which starts out similar to the minor illness and then is followed by stiffness of the neck, vomiting, severe headache, pain in the limbs and back. And usually you have complete recovery. And minor illness is what starts paralytic polio. And you usually have the minor illness, then a symptom-free period, followed by the rapid onset of flaccid paralysis with fever and progression within a few days. And less than 1% of infections are associated with paralysis. And in fact, depending on the 3 polio serotypes, some are more virulent than others, with type 2 being the least virulent, where you may get paralytic disease, for example, 1 in 1,000 infections. So what is the clinical syndrome? One, it's asymmetric, so that one side of the body may be affected more than the body and more than other things. It's a descending paralysis. So the paralysis begins in the central parts of the muscles and then moves out to the periphery. And you'll get diminished or loss of tendon reflexes. And that's not because the sensory system is impacted, but the efferent arm, the muscle system, is impacted. And you can have spinal bulbar, and bulbar. And paralysis is usually permanent, yet you may get partial recovery, but if you still have paralysis at 6 months, that's going to be permanent. And the way polio kills is if it paralyzes the breathing muscles, the muscles of respiration. So that slide I showed you of the people in the iron lungs were people whose respiratory muscles were paralyzed, and they needed to be generally for a lifetime in some sort of respirator to help them breathe. So what is the basic epidemiology? The age group most infected in low and middle income countries has been 6 to 24 months of age. So young children, and particularly with poor hygiene and sanitation, children may not be willing to share their toys, but they're sure happy to share their germs. And a lot of the transmission occurs there. The case fatality rate is generally about 5%, although there are some outbreaks with as much as almost 40% case fatality rates, but those are the exceptions, not the rule. Most persons are infectious immediately before and 1 to 2 weeks after onset of paralysis. And as I told you earlier, it's excreted more in the feces than saliva, 3 to 6 weeks in the feces, 2 weeks in saliva. The incubation period to the minor illness is usually 3 to 6 days after exposure. The infection to onset of paralysis is usually 1 to 3 weeks, although there's a wide range. The laboratory diagnosis is very, very good, but you've got to get good stool specimens and ship them to an appropriate laboratory to be tested. So let's talk about polio. One of the big things that Jonas Salk did is he realized there are 3 wild polioviruses, type 1, type 2, and type 3. And they don't induce very good cross protection against each other. And that's why the initial polio vaccines used for eradication were trivalent, types 1, type 2, type 3. There has been more than a 99% reduction of wild polio virus since this all began in 1988, the eradication program. And type 2 was certified as eradicated. The last naturally occurring case in 1999 in Aligarh, India, interestingly, where I worked on smallpox. Type 3 was certified as eradicated in 2019. So only type 1 is there. But the problem is the Sabin oral live attenuated or weakened vaccine, unfortunately, rarely can cause polio. It can do it in 2 ways. One is called VAP, vaccine-associated paralytic polio. And this is when the virus given to an individual mutates within that individual and reacquires the neurovirulence characteristics of polio and can cause polio. It is extremely rare, 1 case in 4 to 5 million doses, but when you're using polio around the world, it can get substantial. The other thing it can do is in close contacts. But what was really concerning, and the biggest problem in eradication today, is something called vaccine-derived polioviruses, VDPVs, and CVDPVs, circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses, are of greatest concern. This is what happens when you use the Sabin parent virus in a highly susceptible population. The vaccine virus can be transmitted from person to person, which we thought was a great thing because it allowed us to vaccinate people we weren't reaching in our program. But it turns out, as it spreads, it can mutate and reacquire not only the neurovirulence properties of the wild virus, but also the transmissibility properties of the wild virus and cause polio outbreaks. And the big villain here is type 2, which accounts for about 90% of these CBDPV outbreaks. In addition, although it doesn't necessarily cause paralysis, there's something called immune deficient IVDPVs, and that is primarily people in B-cell immune deficiencies who, when they get the vaccine, their immune system doesn't clear it, and they become chronically infected, and chronic shedders, and could potentially reseed populations. So, as I mentioned, we have two tools. The tool that is used most is the oral polio vaccine developed by Albert Sabin and available in the early 60s. And then the tool used particularly in high-income countries and now all over the world is the inactivated polio vaccine, developed originally by Jonas Salk and became available in the United States in the early 50s and now is available worldwide and has to be given by injection versus the oral vaccine being given orally. And this just shows you the two vials of it, the inactivated vaccine and the Sabin. And then what I'll be talking about a little later is the development of what's called a novel OPV2, where it has been genetically stabilized so it doesn't become a CBDPV. So why was the oral polio vaccine the main vaccine used around the world? One, it's easy to administer. You can train non-technical volunteers. It produces not only high levels of individual protection, but it infects the gut and the pharynx. It induces immune response and thereby protects them from getting infected. It could spread through shedding to others, which we thought, as I said earlier, would be great. And so we have data, for example, in the United States from years past of unvaccinated children in Houston and Detroit, for example, which showed substantial immunity to polio, which was a great thing. But the bad thing is the vaccine-associated paralytic polio, which were estimated to lead to 300 to 500 cases a year in the world. And then the bigger problem are these circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses. The other problem with the oral vaccine in low and middle income countries is it often takes more doses to get to high immunity levels. And there are a variety of reasons for it. One, with the trivalent vaccine, the vaccine types competed with one another. Type 2 was the strongest one. And so when you were using only the trivalent vaccine, types 1, 2, and 3, you had to give multiple doses. Not that children couldn't be protected, but they needed more opportunities because of the interference with each other. Diarrhea also played a role, which was more common in lower and middle income countries. Competition with other enteroviruses. Maternal antibody could also impact young children's immune response. And in low and middle income countries, given all the exposures to polioviruses, those titers could be high. I mentioned the issue of B-cell immune deficiency. And then other theories are micronutrient deficiencies, parasitic infestations, and tropical enteropathy. And this is an example from Uttar Pradesh, looked at by Nick Grassley and colleagues from Imperial College London, looking at the effectiveness by numbers of doses of trivalent vaccine versus monovalent type 1. And what you can see here is with the trivalent vaccine, you didn't reach an immunity level of 80% until you got against type 1 until you got 14 or 15 doses. With monovalent OP1, you could do that with 5 to 6 doses. But this is much higher number of doses than you need in an industrialized country. But it is a key, and that's why the strategy for polio has multiple doses, multiple opportunities to get to the immunity levels needed to break the chains of transmission. The inactivated polio vaccine must be given by injection. It is really super at protecting the individual from paralysis. It includes great systemic immunity and hence prevents the virus from entering the central nervous system. It appears equivalent to OPV in inducing pharyngeal immunity, but it is clearly inferior to OPV in inducing intestinal immunity. In other words, it doesn't really decrease the prevalence in shedding a stool, for example, if you challenge with an OPV. It does decrease duration and quantity, and it is substantially more costly to produce because most of it, even to this day, is produced from wild polioviruses, and you need to be very careful on that. And also because it's an inactivated vaccine, it doesn't reproduce, you need higher levels of antigen in there than you do in the oral vaccine. So IPV provides high levels of individual protection, but the extent that it reduces transmission is debatable. And these are data from many years ago, looking at 4 groups of people. 1 is susceptible control subjects. 2 is people who have received IPV vaccine. 3 is OPV vaccine, and 3 is naturally immune. And then they were challenged with a type 1 oral vaccine virus. And you can see here, there was no difference in the proportion shedding in their stool between the susceptibles and the IPV vaccinated, about half in the OPV and naturally immune. There was some decrease in duration of shedding, but not as good as with OPV and naturally immune. The IPV in the fecal titers reduced things by about a log, the OPV 3 logs reduction. And here's another study by Ida Honorado and others looking at children who got vaccinated with IPV only or OPV only, challenged then with a type 1 OPV, and you could see virtually no difference in shedding in the pharynx, but substantially different shedding patterns in the stool, which is one of the reasons OPV has been the major choice in most of the world for getting rid of polio. Now we've found the need for newer vaccines. I already mentioned novel OPV vaccines, and the novel OPV2 is now in use. There is development of novel OPV1 and OPV3, and again, these are genetically stable so that they won't revert back and become circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses and cause outbreaks. There's also efforts, because of the costs of the inactivated vaccine, to make them cheaper, such as fractional doses given intradermal or intramuscular. And now we have, and that's received emergency use listing, a Sabin IPV, which you don't have to worry about in terms of production as much, because you're not as worried as a leak with that as you would be for a leak of a wild poliovirus. And this just shows you a schematic of what was done to develop the NOPV2s, and it's a modification with insertions of various nucleotides in the virus to prevent it from mutating and taking on the neurovirulence and transmissibility characteristics. And one of the issues is what should be done in eradication. And in 2017, the World Health Organization's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization recommended that countries should include inactivated vaccine in their schedule, starting at 14 weeks, and a second dose greater than or equal to 14 dose, greater than or equal to 4 months after the first dose, as a way of continuing population immunity, just to make sure things are okay, and that countries without polio essential facilities, and these are facilities that store the virus even after it's eradicated, should maintain IPV for at least 10 years. And for those with these polio essential facilities, potentially use IPV forever. We'd have to see what it is. And one of the issues is why this is important is I mentioned the last naturally occurring case of smallpox was in 1977 in Somalia, but the last cases of smallpox were actually 2 cases, including 1 death in 1978 in the United Kingdom as a result of a laboratory break in containment. So we need to make sure we don't reintroduce it after it's eradicated. And this just gives you an example of some of the concerns with IPV. Israel was certified as polio-free in June 2002 with the WHO European region. 11 years later, the wild polio virus was isolated from monitoring of wastewater or sewage samples. And what they found is, even though they were using all IPV at that time, they saw no paralytic cases, but from 11 months, they saw continued transmission silently. And that led them to go back to a sequential schedule to get the benefits of both vaccines, IPV and OPV. On the other hand, this is Yogyakarta, Indonesia, where they were surrounded by countries using, or states using OPV. They switched to IPV, got high-level coverage, and they didn't get any OPV circulating. So that's why it's not completely clear how good IPV is in preventing community transmission. The Sabin IPV I mentioned, it is substantially cheaper to produce. It's so if you do get an unintentional or unintentional release, it's not as virulent, although there is still concern in low-income countries where polio can be high. It has been WHO pre-qualified, and work is underway to develop alternative non-infectious seed strains for an IPV. So what is the polio eradication strategy? One is routine immunization. Get as high as possible. And then at least several times a year, develop mass campaigns called supplemental immunization activities, or SIAs, vaccinating all children less than 5 years of age, regardless of vaccination status. And again, this is to give people multiple episodes or multiple opportunities to get vaccinated and overcome any resistance and get immune. And then careful surveillance, acute flaccid paralysis, collect stools, see which are polio, which are not. And environmental sampling is extremely important, wastewater sampling to help. And in fact, what we've seen recently is virus detected in wastewater in Israel, in London, and in New York, which helps us in our surveillance system. And then when we see continued transmission, mop-up campaigns with vaccines. And then we have ways of accountability. In terms of disease surveillance, we look at indicators of acute flaccid paralysis. So there should be as a background rate of non-polio FP in kids less than 15 years, at least 2 per 100,000. If you're seeing less than that, you got to be worried about the quality of surveillance. And at least 80% of AFP cases investigated have at least 2 stools collected at least 24 hours apart and sent to a global accredited laboratory network. And then you have environmental surveillance. There also is coverage monitoring, because we need to assure people are doing it. And one is important is, particularly for mass campaigns, they'll mark fingers of kids they vaccinate with ink, and then independent monitors come in and look and see how successful the team has been. And then development of a global accredited polio network. There are 145 such laboratories in 92 countries, and their job is to identify and isolate the polio cases and determine whether they're polio virus or vaccine type, whether they're types 1, 2, or 3, and whether they're vaccine derived or straight from the vaccine, and to conduct genomic sequences to look at how closely viruses may be related. So if you've got 2 viruses that are 10% difference, that would suggest that they were 2 separate introductions, or that you missed 10 years of continuing transmission. And this just shows you the data behind that 1% a year. And this is sequencing that is done in the VP1 region of the virus. And what you can see here is a Sabin vaccine-related poliovirus is CVDPV requires greater than 1% change in the nucleotides compared to the parent Sabin virus, and an orphan virus is 1.5% difference than any other viruses. And just to show you again, Sabin-like is less than 1% difference, vaccine-derived 1 to 15%, and wild viruses are greater than 15% difference from the parent Sabin. And the criteria for poliovirus genotypes has been defined, and you can look at the issue, and a strain represents a new cluster if it has at least 5% nucleotide sequence. So what is the progress to date? In 1985, the Pan American Health Organization launched an initiative to eradicate polio in the Americas by 1990. They were so successful that in 1988, the World Health Assembly passed a resolution to eradicate polio globally by 2000. In the last case of the polio in the Americas was in 1991 in Peru, and it was certified as polio-free in 1994. I've already mentioned the type 2 in Aligar in 1999. In 2000, the Western Pacific region, including China, was certified as polio-free. In 2002, Europe was certified as completely polio-free. In 2012, the last case of wild poliovirus type 3 was found in Nigeria. In 2014, India was declared polio-free. In 2015, type 2 was declared eradicated. Only 2 countries now have polio, and this is type 1, Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's endemic countries. And global eradication of type 3 was declared in 2019. In 2002, because of the certification of wild type 2 being gone, polio type 2 in the Sabin vaccine was causing more damage than not, and was taken out of the vaccine. In 2020, Africa was certified as polio-free. And the year to date is we have 22 wild polio viruses in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and 7 in Africa, all in Mozambique, and they are genetically related to a Pakistan virus. But the big problem is almost 400 CVDPVs, and type 2 accounts for the vast majority. And this just puts it in perspective. In 1988, when the eradication program began, there were an estimated 350,000 paralytic cases. If you estimate only 1 in 100 cases are paralytic, that's about 35 million infections, and probably more than that, 125 endemic countries. In 2022, what you could see here is 2 endemic countries, but with cases in Mozambique. And this just shows it in another way. We have made substantial progress, although we've had some resurrection of type 1 wild virus. Types 2 and 3 wild virus are still gone. And the big issue is we have only 2 endemic countries, but we have Mozambique that has been recently infected, not yet considered endemic because it hasn't been at least a year of transmission. And this just shows you what has happened in the last 12 months. And this shows you the wild viruses in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in Mozambique here, and there was one in Malawi. And what you could see here is these green dots are the type 2 CVDPV cases, which are focused most in Africa and parts of Asia. So what does polio mean, a world free of polio? It's complete interruption of transmission and elimination of all polio, wild polioviruses, vaccine-derived polioviruses, and vaccine-associated paralytic polio. The eradication and endgame that went through 2018 considered eradication wild virus, but I think now most people consider the endgame, which includes all 3 of these. Because when you get paralyzed, you get paralyzed. It doesn't matter to the individual what paralyzed them. This just shows the type 2 certification of polio in 2015. And this shows you in 2016, because the type 2 strain in the OPV, 1 interfered with the immunogenicity of type 1 and 3, and was causing VAP and CVDPVs, they said, let's get it out and introduce type 2 immunity through IPV. The problem was that there were unrecognized CVDPV2 outbreaks or chains of transmission going on at the time. And when they stopped, it led to a resurgence. And the tool to fight type 2 at the time was monovalent type 2, and it was like fighting with fire. So as you tried to get rid of a chain of virus, you potentially induced development of other chains as the type 2 Sabin strain circulated from susceptible to susceptible. And this just shows you some of the data, and where type 2 far and away now exceeds the number of cases of any CVDPV, as well as very much exceeds the number of cases of CVDPV. So what is the end game? I mentioned the switch. The world can coordinate. And this was where 155 countries in a 2-week period got rid of and destroyed their trivalent OPV and just kept bivalent and IPV. And again, the type 2 component caused 90% of VDPVs, about a quarter to a third of VAP cases, and interfered with the immune response, which led to the change. So what are we worried about now? One is reintroduction of wild polioviruses. And so that can come from a break in laboratory containment, a break in containment from an IPV manufacturer and an intentional release, bioterrorism. We have had, and I'll show you examples of break and containment, and we need to destroy the viruses in as many places as possible so that we don't get reintroduction. Polio is probably not a good bioweapon because very few infections cause paralysis, but it is theoretically possible. The big issue is we have circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses. We need to break those chains. We do have vaccine-associated paralytic polio, and it will continue if we continue to use the Sabin strains. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have immune-deficient persons who are chronic shedders who could reintroduce the virus if people were susceptible, could start new outbreaks. So these are protocols of what is done when you find a CVDPV outbreak. You do supplemental immunization activities. You target generally 0 to 5 years, although you may go up depending on who's coming down with polio. You enhance surveillance. And then the big issue is to get access to this novel OPV2, which doesn't appear to be associated with development of new CVDPV2s. And that's where we don't have enough right now, but we need to get that supply up. So where are there areas of consensus for the future? MOPV2 is the only tool, but MOPV2 should not be the tool. Novel OPV2 is what we need to accelerate the use and replace MOPV2. The biggest problem is quality. If you don't vaccinate people, you leave them susceptible. And we need to assure we have high quality, and we need to have contingency planning to continue we have adequate supply of all the vaccines we need if there is a problem. And this is just an example of containment to identify places that have it, to destroy the virus, and in many places that don't need it, to certify and contain, and only have a limited number of laboratories that have it, and hopefully eventually get rid of it. And this is just some example. I'm not going to go over it, but you can see here examples of leaks from laboratories over time that led to cases or at least detection of virus in this, and why it's so important to do an adequate job with containment. So just to put in perspective what we were thinking, in 1988, we thought we needed to just eradicate 3 wild polioviruses. We now realize we need to eradicate 6 polioviruses: wild poliovirus type 1, 2, and 3, and Sabin vaccine viruses. In 1988, we thought, all we need is trivalent OPV. Now we know we need monovalent and bivalent OPV and novel OPV. In 1988, OPV could cause BAP in recipients or close contacts. Now we know OPV can cause circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses and outbreaks. In 1988, we thought all we needed was acute flaccid paralysis surveillance. We now know we need environmental surveillance, wastewater, such as was used to detect polio in Israel, London, and a substantial number of isolates in New York recently. In 1988, we thought primary immune deficient chronic shedders could develop polio, but were not a danger to the community. We now realize they are a danger or potential danger. Initial thinking in 1980 is the inactivated polio vaccine had no role in achieving eradication. We now know it does have an important role, particularly as Sabin viruses are being withdrawn. In 1988, the thinking was sustaining eradication with a major focus on containment was not really considered that much. We now know it's extremely important to do that. And in 1988, the thinking was, as we did with smallpox, we could simply stop vaccination. Now we feel there's a need to continue it, at least for some period, until we are confident that it won't be reintroduced. And again, in 1988, we thought everything we needed to know for eradication was already known. Now we know we need extensive research and safer vaccines, development of vaccines that not only provide individual protection, but community protection, the role of IPV and the optimal schedule and making it cheaper, detecting primary immune deficient shedders, and then developing antiviral drugs so we can cure them and prevent them from shedding, and the development for genetically stable oral polio vaccines. So what is the meaning of polio to the world? We've got new technologies being done, monovalent OPV, novel routes of administration, and that's research that's going on. Adjuvants, we've developed genetically stable, better surveillance tools, and antiviral drugs. And then we have a vision: permanently interrupt all polio viruses and stop CBDPV2s. This is what we want, and we want to do it sooner rather than later. And what we need, these are the challenges: lack of access in controversial areas, such as in Afghanistan. We need to partnership with communities. We need to get better performance, government ownership, and work on overcoming polio fatigue with all of these things: political advocacy, community advocacy, campaigns, etc. And this is the goal here at the present time, is by 2026 to certify eradication. And in the interest of time, why don't I stop now, and I'd be happy to take any questions. One of the issues that people believe is, why are we doing this? We're down to so few polio cases. We have so many other health problems. And the big issue, unfortunately, is if we stop, we're going to have a major resurgence. And so what we need to do is finish the job, but finish the job in a way that we build overall routine immunization programs, that we train people in surveillance that could be used for other diseases, that we maintain a laboratory capacity that can be used for other diseases. And we have seen this as a lot of the polio resources have been used in helping countries combat COVID-19. So to leave as a lasting contribution, not only the eradication of polio, but a continuing, ongoing help in enhancing health of the world forever. And we need to remember that polio eradication is a need for all of us. When a high-income country helps a low-income country, it's two things. One, for humanitarian reasons, it's helping a low-income country get rid of any burdens of polio, but it also increases the domestic health security of the high-income country, a win-win situation. And polio pledging day, I think, is today, and we need those resources to finish the job. And it's a win-win, a win for the countries that currently have polio and a win for others. And as we've seen with polio introduction into New York, London, and Israel, that our health security will be a lot better if we can get rid of polio everywhere. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orenstein. This was an excellent and very informative grand rounds, and excellent on Polio Pledge Day also, so pretty apt for today. We have a question from Nigeria. The question is, following the switch we should no longer have new cases of CVDPV type 2. So, do we now have type 1 VDPVs? When do we plan to completely withdraw OPV?
I think that's a very, very good question. One is we got rid of type 2 in the trivalent vaccine because it was doing more harm than good at that time. We had no cases of wild type 2. And so that's why we got rid of it. With type 1, there is still wild poliovirus type 1, and we cannot yet get rid of it. We're not seeing much in the way of CVDPV3 viruses, and it is such a major step to go from, let's say, bivalent OPV, which is the standard OPV in use now around the world, 1 and 3, to monovalent type 1. So the feeling right now is we continue bivalent 1, 3 until we certify eradication of wild poliovirus type 1. And that's why we're developing novel OPV1s and OPV3s that are not yet here, but that should we need them, if there is CVDP1 or CVDPV3 outbreaks occurring, we could use them. But those viruses don't seem to be anywhere near as problematic with CVDPVs than the others. So the goal right now is use the BOPV in a combined schedule with IPV, which gives you some background OPV2 immunity and enhances immunity to type 1 and 3, including intestinal immunity. It boosts that. And then we have a process for global certification and follow that process. And when type 1 is certified, then we need to move away from use of the bivalent vaccines and go to IPV with the potential of using those vaccines should they emerge or reemerge somewhere.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. There's a question on YouTube regarding the recent case reported in New York City of a young patient with paralysis. What was the cause of the resurgence in NYC of poliovirus?
A very, very good question. That was a 20-year-old person who was unvaccinated. And that's one of the issues that we have to address is vaccine hesitancy. My favorite quote is vaccines don't save lives. Vaccinations save lives. A vaccine dose that remains in the vial is 0% effective. We need to get people vaccinated. And the problem we see is polio viruses get transmitted silently. So we don't know exactly where the New York virus came from, but we do know it's genetically related to other viruses that are circulating. And that's why it's so important to get rid of it all over the world so we don't have these episodes. And my real hope is people will see that we need to invest in getting rid of those chains because we can get it back here. And then now that it's back in the United States, we need to get people vaccinated. We need to overcome their hesitancy, and we need to overcome any barriers to vaccination.
Right, no, that's very well said. Dr. Orenstein, I was just looking in the New York data that only 37% of children in multiple communities in New York are vaccinated, you know. So that is also very eye-opening. And as you mentioned, there's a huge need for getting the children vaccinated, especially because now the virus is in New York, you know.
Exactly. And I think what we need is it's often easy to get people to invest in developing a new technology, but we need investments in implementation science. When I was director of the US immunization program, my director of communications used to say, you need the right message delivered by the right messenger through the right communications channel. who do these people trust? What do they want to hear? And it's unfortunate because most of these people never have seen polio. It doesn't mean much to them.
Hmm.
And we need to overcome that. And we need to come not only in New York, but in other places, because we may be sitting on populations just with high levels of susceptibility. And they're not only a danger for their communities, they're a danger to all our communities.
Yeah, I actually, because I have a daughter, so I went and checked if she's vaccinated for polio. She has got all the 4 doses here in California, you know. So it seems there's a mandate, and as you mentioned, because of the vaccine hesitancy, people opt out of it, you know. So we have to increase awareness so that people, you know, embrace the
Exactly.
vaccine, you know.
Exactly. And I think that, and that's, in a sense, vaccines have become victims of their own success because people in 1955, I showed you, there was no problem. People were so scared of polio.
Hmm.
They're not scared of it now. And that is a potential problem for the future.
Right, right. I think we are almost at time. So these were all the questions. We have a message from Dr. Maria Nelis Gomares from Brazil, from Sao Paulo. She said, "Thank you for the important information, excellent presentation, and a lot of excellent presentation notes in the chat box. So we really appreciate this. Our community from different parts of the world are very grateful for your presentation today and also your previous presentations, you know, which have been very informative. So thank you so much, Dr. Orenstein, for the wonderful grand rounds for Health for the World community. And this was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. And thank you all for listening and help us finish this job.
Yes.
Make this a historical talk only.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Orenstein. Have a great day.
Thank you
Thank you
very
for
much.
joining me.
Bye now.